I am delighted to welcome all of you to the first lecture of this year, calendar year's Presidential Colloquium series, Thinking Out Loud, Deciphering Mysteries of Our World and Beyond. And today, I know I speak for everybody when I say that I'm just really thrilled that one of our own, Professor Ayanna Howard, is here. She is the Linda J. and Mark C. Smith Endowed Chair in Bioengineering in the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology. How's that for a title, right? And she's also a member of the Brown University class of 1993. You've been back a lot. Welcome back. Thanks for coming back again. It's great to have you. So in 1941, long before robots began exploring ocean floors and vacuuming floors and doing everything else that they do, scientist and science fiction writer Isaac Asimov coined the word roboticist. It was a new word. And now here we are many, many years later, and it's actually a great description of how Dr. Howard defines herself. During her career, she has designed robots for, among other purposes, studying the impact of global warming on Antarctic ice shelves, and supporting learning and development for children with autism and cerebral palsy. So for her, robots are, in the way that computers and cell phones once were, best seen as this new technological frontier with great potential to enhance human life. Now, I think we know that there are people in society who are uncomfortable with the prospect of robots being deeply integrated into their daily lives. Where, they ask, are the boundaries, and what if we lose control over the human cognitive capacity and artificial intelligence that powers robots? These ideas, they're actually good questions. They've been the stuff of science fiction for many, many years, ever since Asimov was writing, maybe before then. From what I've heard and read, though, Dr. Howard takes an optimistic view, noting that when she works on robots, she wants them to, quote, be expressive, empathetic, all the good parts of being human. So it's at this really fascinating societal dynamics that lies at the heart of her aptly titled lecture today, Robots Improving Our Future or Leading Us to Doom. I love the title. So, let's face it, robots do raise provocative questions. Brown is a place that welcomes provocative questions, so I'm really looking forward to hearing her talk, and I want to ask you to join me in welcoming her. So, thanks. No. Now, this is in the grand tradition of Brown. We now have somebody who will formally introduce the talk, and Professor Chris Rose will do that. Come on.
Okay, so this is year 3 of this talk series that Chris has so delightfully endowed for us. Notice I said endowed. And we have name chairs up front for everybody, new ones. But everybody that's been to these, how many recidivists do we have here? So how many folks have been to a Thinking Out Loud before? So, not a whole lot. So this is great. We have a new audience this year. And the whole premise of these talks is, well, first off, so what I want you to do is, normally when you do an introduction, you look at the bio and you do something with the bio and you hold it up. So who does not have a program? Okay? All right, so Stephanie over there, right? No program. Well, find one. If you want that, look at the back of this, and then we're done, because I'm not going to say any of that. And the reason I'm not going to say any of that, so I gave a talk at a school up the road that shall not be named last week. And, they did the usual introduction, it's embarrassing and whatever else. But and I kind of said, that's kind of ridiculous. And the reason it's kind of ridiculous is that, people of this caliber, they came to play. So Ayanna is one of those movers and shakers in her area. So, reading all of this stuff is not what this particular series is about. We could have any number of folks that have, wonderful prizes and, have chaired professors and whatever else. What's different about our speakers, and especially different about Ayanna, is that she has melded across a variety of different areas and built a new area. So many of us in academia, we do one thing, And that's kind of what we do. Ayanna has reinvented herself and her area multiple times, okay, starting from here. So how many engineering undergraduates we have here? Yeah, okay, great. So, think about how you think about your engineering career here already and the wonders and the struggles. Ayanna went through exactly those things and went on and took all of that knowledge and melded it into something new. So the speakers for this series are of that type. They're a little bit crazy, okay? What Ayanna's done is a little bit nuts because it's new. I mean, it really is, but it's impactful and it's wonderful. So it's really, it really gives me a lot of pleasure since I've only been here a couple of years and I'm beginning to understand the Brown ethos. It really gives me a lot of pleasure to welcome home a native daughter, Ayanna Howard. So please, welcome Ayanna.
So what I want to do is bring you into my world. And I can say robotics is great, robotics is wonderful, it will take over the world, but I really want you to understand what robotics is. And there is the positive, but there's also the negative, and really give you the power to ask those questions, because I think what's happening is that unless we have people who are users of the technology asking the questions, robotics we're going to do what we're going to do. We're going to create wonderful things, and they're going to be introduced into society, and it's not going to be until later that we're like, oh my gosh, what have we done? And so what I want to really do is lay the foundation for those questions. And so robotics is one of these things is I can go anywhere, and people have opinions. And so I say, what is a robotics? And there's ideas about from movies and iRobot and people destroying the world and RoboCop. And my favorite is, of course, my Rosie. That's my favorite. But people have ideas. So it's the one thing in the field in academia that I can talk to a 5-year-old and I can talk to a 90-year-old, and there's an opinion. It might be right or wrong based on what I think, but they have an opinion. And it's the one thing in our world when we think about robotics, it's about robots and people. Robots are there and designed to emulate us. So if you think about it, they are our future. And so all the questions and all the fears are based on us creating a new life in general. And what does that look like? And what can go wrong? And so that's really why it's interesting and fascinating, but it's also quite dangerous. And so when I go up, 15 years ago when I talked about robotics, the emotions were slightly different. And so it was usually anxious, like, oh, robots are going to take over my job. And my grandfather, he worked in Detroit, and they fired him because they brought in the robotic systems. And there's emotions associated with robotics. I mean, if I say, oh, what about robotics? It's not just like, yeah, that's a good math equation. No, it's about, oh, I'm really excited, or it's like, well, I just think that this technology is going to destroy the world. There's an opinion, and there's an emotion associated with this robotics world. It's very tightly coupled to who we are as a society in terms of a humanity. And robots are here. They're here to stay. They're going to continue. So these are the robots from Georgia Tech. I just have to highlight that. And so one of the things about robotics, and I think there's a camp of roboticists that think about robotics not in terms of manufacturing, but in terms of why we have these fears is really to help society. And so the things we think about in terms of robotics is that next stage. What can we do with robotics that actually pushes the envelope? And it could be robotics as musicians, and so they engage us in a new way of enjoying music. Or it could be robotics in healthcare, and they allow us to stay in our home as we get older. And so we as roboticists, a lot of us think about robotics as having societal impact of the next generation. What can we do with our theories and our algorithms and push forward? And this is actually different. It goes beyond the science fiction and goes beyond the traditional. And so if you think about robotics back, and I would say in my grandfather's age, robotics was about manufacturing, and it was about military, and it was about, taking these systems and moving in big systems, and people weren't really integrated with it. And so you brought in robotics into manufacturing, and the people were fired, and they left. Or you think about robotics in terms of manipulation in the field, and robots are out there as tanks, but you don't have people interacting with it. That's so much different now. Now, when we design robotics and we think about robotics in these new generations, we're talking about robotics as robot surgeons that are used in conjunction with people. So it's not that these robot surgeons are just like, yeah, we're going to put a patient and figure it out. these robots are being used with the expertise of surgeons. And we have robot, basically, teleoperators, where we can now have a surgeon who is maybe stuck in their Providence office, and there's a patient that's over in, say, Uganda. And now they can actually diagnose and interact with this person with this robot as interface. And we have robots that allow children who are locked in or who are unable to go to school actually participate in activities with their peers. And what happens is the children are interacting with this robot because it is connected to their friend and an avatar. And so robots have this new space, and yeah, we even have robots. In fact, this is it is a hotel in Japan, fully booked, so you can't get a reservation now, that is staffed by robotics. And they have different types of what you think of robotics. So you can go in and you can decide, do I want to go to the robot dinosaur or do I want to go to the robot humanoid? And you interact and you can ask, okay, I like my bags taken up. And the robot will actually take your bags to your room. And you go into your room and you talk to their version of Alexa and say, you know, I'd like to order some dinner from the cafeteria, and it will come and be delivered. And so these are the kinds of experience we have, and kind of crazy, there's even a robot pastor that exists in some places that will, if you decide that you want to get married by a robot pastor, is fully ordained, so there's no problem with that, and you can actually get hooked up in terms of that. And so robots, if you think about this new wave of robotics, robots are really being used in spaces and with people. And so that's different than the robots of the old. That's different than, say, the robots of 15 and 20 years ago. The robots of today are really about interacting with people, which means that it requires a whole new way of thinking about how we design robotic systems and how we design them to really impact everyone, not just me building my robot for me, but building robotics for everybody. So it's a different way of thinking, and I'm going to kind of get you through the transitions of, one, how that thinking process evolved, but then some of the lessons I've learned that kind of scare me because of the way people in our society are designed. So these are some of my robots, and just kind of to lay the foundation, I do what you call human-robot interaction. So what that means is I take robots and I put them in different scenarios with people. And so we've done everything from, taking robots, interacting with scientists to look at, glaciers and global warming and try to grab scientific measurements. So then I have to understand, what is it that scientists want and desire, and how do I provide information to them? All the way to robots underwater to actually help geologists in terms of underwater archaeology put things together and do some surveying. And what does that look like if I have a robot in that scenario, or sending them out to work with the NASA astronauts underwater, and robots for children. And through all of that, we go through studies and studies and studies, which means that I see people of all walks of life, all economic levels, all gender, all educational levels. And there's some key things that I found about people in general. And so, which kind of is contrary to a hypothesis, because I'm a person, so I make my hypothesis based on typically me, but there's different. So one thing, and I'm going to walk you through these lessons and use examples from research to do this. So one thing I've learned is humans don't want perfection. What are you telling me? Okay, robots are like perfect. I can program them. They do exactly what I want them to do, go from A to B, fairly perfect. They can correct themselves. People do not actually want robots that are perfect. So maybe in manufacturing, you don't want a door that falls off, but when you have robots interacting with people, they do not want robots that are optimal. So this baffled me, and I'll kind of walk you through that. So one of the things I do is I interact with children with disabilities. And so I want to lay the foundation because sometimes I have folks who have no kids, so they don't understand the ramifications. And sometimes I have folks who don't have kids with disabilities. So it's like, yeah, that's someone else. But the fact is, everyone in this room, if you live long enough, you will have a disability fact. And why is that? So the way you define a disability is a change in your normative function. So what does that mean? So that means if you play any kind of sports at the age of 18 and at the age of 30, this is still how you make your income, but now maybe you have a little arthritis in that little elbow, maybe you can't jump as high, but you have to make a living. You have just had a change in your normative function. So robotics can actually help. Now, if you think about longevity, you are now 70, you're 75. You can't remember quite the way you used to remember, just because the way the processing works, you have a lot stored in there. But you want to stay in your home. And the doctor has said, well, if you don't take your medication all the time, we can't allow you to stay in the home. You have to have a caregiver, or we have to put you in a nursing home. But you're functional. Having a robot that just provides reminders about your medication, you have just increased your quality of life. And so when we think about robotics in this space and we think about disabilities, we think about this domain, i.e. all of the individuals, i.e. you, that live long enough where you need and want to stay in your home, but you need this kind of offset to increase your capabilities. Now I work, that's my motivation to start thinking about, yeah, maybe I should work in robotics, because that's my little tease to you, to work in robotics. Now, if you think about children, so this is my space. One of the things about children with disabilities is our healthcare service is actually really great in terms of our surgeons and our doctors. Now, the negative means that we have an increased rate of children with disabilities. So before, it used to be that if you had a child that was born at, say, 6 months, may or may not live. Now, 6 months is like, oh, there's no problem with that. The problem is if you have a preemie, the likelihood that they have a disability is greatly increased. And then we won't even talk about autism. If you look at the rate, that has definitely increased. And so you have this upsurge of children with disabilities that are introduced into our society. Many of them are cognitively aware. They could be productive citizens, but the system is not made for them. It is not designed for them. And so robotics can actually assist. And so one of the things that clinicians and therapists do is that they work with these children in order to do therapy, to have these kids meet their developmental milestones. So maybe you have a child with cerebral palsy, comes in, has difficulties moving in terms of gaits or reaching, and so a therapist will work with them over and over and over again. And it's a sign of neuroplasticity. So if you do something over and over again, sports, for example, reading math equations, you do it, you practice, you practice, you practice, you get better. Even if you're like, oh, I'm not really good at math, you practice, you practice, you practice, you'll get better. Same as in therapy. If you practice something like, I'm reaching, I'm playing ball, like, look at me. Am I gonna play ball? Well, I actually play ball pretty well, because practice, practice, practice. So that's really the aspect of therapy. The problem is that most kids don't like therapy. I mean, it's hard. It's like, you have to do homework. If you don't have a parent at home saying, homework, 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 kids are probably not gonna do it. Therapy is the same way. If you don't have someone in the home that says, therapy, 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 you're not going to do it. And the other thing about therapy is that it's an amazing environment. So if any of you have, as adults, have gone to therapy, it's actually pretty boring. For a kid, therapy is like this playground. It's all of these things and these objects and these wonderful things and playthings. And the reason is because therapists have to engage the child at their level. So they have to use aspects of play and interaction to engage these children. So these are typical therapy scenarios in terms of environment, play, bright colors, all of these things. The problem is that therapy really requires one-on-one interaction. One-on-one interaction, so that means that you have to think about something like robotics. So robotics is really the key, and I'm gonna say that because I'm a roboticist, of course, but robotics is the key for this therapy. And so just a little bit of story of how I got into this space. Of course, like anything, I'm an engineer. I was grown up as an engineer, came to Brown, and as an engineer, one of the things we learned at Brown was look for the problems. If I see something, you do something, and you figure it out. And so I knew I wanted to do something. I was doing some outreach things. I wanted to get into healthcare, didn't know what that was about. So we did observations. It basically means you become a student. You go into a clinic and you're like, okay, I'm just a student. I'm gonna act like a student and just observe. And one of the things we found, well, first, there's a lot of opportunities for engineering, computer science to work in this domain. But one of the things we found was there's a therapy protocol called constraint-based movement therapy. And so it's one of the most effective things. So if you think about your dominant hand, and I say, okay, here's your dominant hand, I'm right-handed. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take your dominant hand and I'm going to strap it down and I'm gonna send you out to the world. So go to class, go to work, drive, and you are gonna use your non-dominant hand. You're gonna get better, trust me. You're just gonna figure it out. You're gonna figure out how to eat better. If you're into sports, you're gonna figure out how to throw. So that's what this constraint-based movement therapy is. Adults, very effective. They do it with teenagers. But now imagine you're a 6-year-old. You come into the therapist. First of all, you already have a disability, and the therapist is like, guess what, Johnny? We're going to strap that arm down, and we're going to send you to school. Have fun. Okay, so very, very negative in terms of, first of all, you have a disability. You don't want to be different at that age. And now you're going to strap my arm. I'm already having difficulties. So what we decided to do, we said, you know what? We're going to make it interesting, and we're going to have a play, and we're going to do this hypothesis. So this was one of our very first studies. And so we're going to say, robots. Robots are fun. We don't have to convince a kid that robots are fun. I mean, it's like one of those things, you're like, you want a robot? Yes. I mean, we don't even have to force it. It's one of the easiest things that we can do. And then we say, okay, to use this robot, we're going to have a little competition. So all your little friends, we're going to take the robot home, and we're going to give you this thing called a nunchuck. And so we basically hacked a nunchuck. And what you have to do is you have to use your involved side, so basically, in my case, the left-hand side, and you have to figure out how to use that nunchuck in order to make your robot dance. So we use dance. And at the end, we're going to bring you all together, and we're going to have a dance-off to see who's best. So very simple in terms of we're using education, learning, competition, and we're using this fun aspect. What happened was amazing. So first of all, we just said, do it and come back. What we saw is at the end, not only did they do it like every day for like the 20 minutes, and so we didn't even have to, we asked them to log it. But at the end, I mean, literally, if you look at these kids, you could see this difficulty that they were having in terms of moving this, because some of them had severe disabilities in terms of moving it. But they were doing it, and you could see them moving like, this is what I can do, I'm moving. And we said, that's it, we got it. Robots, therapy, this is it, we're just gonna send a bunch of dinosaurs out, and we have solved the world's problem, and this is it. And the clinician said, well, okay, that was cute, really nice. No, you gotta do more than that. And so that's really where it started in terms of looking at therapy and looking at robotics to see what we're gonna do. And I'm gonna get to the part of being not optimal. So one of the things about kids, so you guys are sitting here, you're listening to me, you're watching my videos, and I have some really cool videos as well later on. This is an acquired behavior, just so you know. You are actually trained and taught to sit here and listen. It's an acquired behavior, i.e. someone back in the day, you had ants in your pants and some parent or some teacher beat you to sit still and pay attention. Acquired behavior. Kids are not designed that way. I mean, and there's a reason. So if you think about learning and the process, it's about this change and your cognitive process is changing. And so I'm looking at something, I'm trying to figure out cause and effect, I'm trying to figure out facial expressions, I'm trying to figure out that. And so what the brain does and why kids always switch, and preschool teachers are really good at this, is I'm looking at something, I'm getting it, oh, there, snaps. Okay, let's get to the next thing, snap, let me get to the next thing. So kids are designed that way. And yet we as teachers are like, oh, no, we're gonna spend an hour on this lecture for 50 minutes because that's the protocol. The kids are not designed that way. And so we had to figure this out. How do we get robotics to deal with this and understand that if I have a child, how do I figure out whether they're engaged or not? How do you even quantify that? I mean, is that a scientific term, engage? Disengage? Can you recognize that? Clinicians really recognize it. Teachers, preschool and kindergarten teachers really recognize that. Engineers, we don't recognize it that well. So how do you do this? The other thing is that kids are different. And so I have a child, so these are two of my kids. So before I thought labels. Labels mean nothing. So I have a diagnosis. I have a child with CP. Like, okay, I got that, CP, that means a disability. I just have to come in and do some movement stuff. And a child with CP who is less severe, I might not even notice, but there's actually some differences in terms of how they move versus a child who has high spasticity, who has very little intent, i.e. if I put something in front of the child, it's like there's no movement toward reaching for that. And yet, their papers basically say child with CP. So how do I design a robot that's adaptive to all individuals, all kids, whether they can move, whether they have the cognitive ability to understand instructions? And so for a robot, what we've learned is that when a person comes in, the label means nothing. We actually have to do a diagnosis that's personalized to that child. If a child comes in, we can't assume anything. We can't assume because of their gender, because of their race, because of the way they walk, anything. We have to do our own battery of tests to figure out where do they fit in terms of our interaction. And so that's one of the things that as an engineer, you're like, I can grade a model. Child with CP, this is what they are, this is the label, this is how I interact. But every child is unique and different. And it's a hard thing to do in robotics to figure this out, to make this happen. And so we have to create a robot that's interactive, has metrics that can be done over and over again, and is individualized. And so how do you do this? And like most engineers, we like to play, we like to design things, and so we do a bunch of things. We make physical games, we make virtual games, we have games that allow you to play with tablets, as well as the world around you. Physical, we use different types of sensors, and so if you think about the IP and the theory and what my students can do in terms of the algorithms, is taking sensor information, processing it, quantifying it, and coming up with metrics for evaluation. And so at the end of the day, what happens is we have an interface that a child can interact with, but is also sound in terms of the IP, sound in terms of the algorithms, and works. And so one of the challenges, of course, is if I have a system, and one of the things we do is we'll test something in the lab, and I tell my students, it's not going to work in the real world. What are you talking about, Professor Howard? It's perfect. I tested it with my friends. It's not going to work in the real world. And 90% of the time, I'm right. Because when you do not use and interact with people that are not like yourself, what happens is you forget stuff, you miss stuff, you don't think about stuff. And so you're in the lab and you have friends. Our first example, you have friends. You're like, okay, we're interacting with this game. And we take it into the system and we're like, oh my gosh, this kid is in a wheelchair. Huh, I didn't think about that. This is a problem. Or you're in the lab and you're like, oh, it's really nice, the system's working, the robot understands. And you go into a home and it's all glass and our sensors are bouncing off and you're like, oh, yeah, there's sun here. Our sensors can't see anything. And so anything we think about in the lab, guaranteed there's gonna be something out there that we didn't consider because we don't have that experience. And so one of the things we do to gain that experience, because there's no way that you can think of all the possible things if you don't live in that child's shoes, is we go out and we experience and we observe. And it's go out, we're gonna go into as many homes as we can. We're gonna go into as many clinics as we can in order to understand. And so this is how this optimality came out. So when you go out into the system, you go out into the world, and you have machines that you know are not gonna work, what it gives you the power to do is always observe and always be aware of, okay, this didn't work, and you start questioning why. And so our very first experiment early on, and so these are some of my robots, we do things like Simon Says, which is if I'm playing with a child, and if you guys remember Simon Says, it's like, do this, and we watch. We learn, one, is that kids will follow instructions. Parents hate robots as being annoying. So if I go like this, do this, do this, do this, and a child sometimes will be like, oh, I like that voice. I'm just gonna just sit here because the robot's gonna keep doing it. And mom is in the back going, oh my gosh, please. Johnny, can you please listen to the robot? Parents are sometimes essential for this. The other thing that we found out, and this is where we discovered the optimal. So one of the things back in the day when we started off, we made these robots optimal. So I engage with a person, a child, and I have them mimic me, and if they don't do it perfectly, I basically repeat and say, no, you didn't do it correctly, do it like this. And I just kind of nag until they get it perfectly in an optimal condition. And me as a robot, I do it optimally. It's just basically we have some kinematics, velocity profiles, so we know how to do this perfectly. And one day we had a system, and we were doing a gait assessment. So basically gait is, in the clinical world, if I'm doing some type of gait practice, it means that the child kind of walks back and forth, back and forth. And so we decided, again, gamifying it, we're gonna play soccer. And so if you think about soccer, it's like, kick the ball, and we said, okay, alternate, kick the ball, so they're moving. And the robot, like anything, real world, it had some kind of error. And so the robot in this instance actually kicked it in the wrong direction. So it was kicking, the robot kicked back and forth, and it went somewhere else. And we were like, oh man, made a mistake. What was interesting is this child basically laughed, eyes lit up, And the child walked over to this ball, kicked it back, was like, silly robot. We were like, wait, hold it, observation, what just happened? Kicked the ball, and of course there's an error, so of course it's gonna happen again. Robot hit it, kicked it again. And you saw this child basically coming out of his comfort zone to interact with this robot. We were like, wait, hold it. Well, first of all, this robot is like really faulty. Of course, my students are like, where's the code? What's going on? Can we download it like now? And I'm looking, I'm going, wait, hold it. There's something here. This child is not complaining, is not stopping. In fact, the child is doing exactly what we want to do, but even enhanced. And so we're like, there's a hypothesis here. There's something here. Let's try to tease this out. You know, there's something, and I call it non-optimal. There's something here. Let's try to tease it out. So we did a bunch of experiments, and we found out that when a robot makes mistakes, and we intentionally introduce mistakes, kids are more engaged for a longer period of time. I.e., they will engage with the robot till basically we're like, you know, student has class in an hour, can we kind of stop now? They will be engaged with the robot, which is contrary to what we think about, okay, have a robot, optimal, therapy. But no, it's not optimal. The other thing that we learned is emotions have a really big effect on the robotic system. So again, I was an engineer. I mean, I took some courses in non-engineering classes, but I didn't take cognitive science. I definitely didn't take a lot of humanities. I took like music and dance. Emotions have a big effect on kids. I can have a robot that is emotional, is emotional and makes mistakes. We're going to open up. Is emotional, and when it makes mistakes, if it has the proper form of responding in an emotional fashion, kids are engaged by that, which is, again, some of these things is like, really, that's amazing.
Darwin, this is how you kill the
It
pigs.
comes all together.
And if there's wood, you try and hit the wood. Like
So
that.
this is a non-optimal robot, emotional.
Okay, you try.
Playing Angry Birds, just so you know. On the other side, robots playing Angry Birds with the kid.
Your turn, Darwin. Go ahead.
That one, it's actually
Oh. Okay, Darwin. So try and throw the bird.
So you can look at, and one of the things is I can cut off the sound and you will still be able to recognize the emotions. So emotions are this universal language. And when you have an emotion or a robot that emotes, what happens is a robot that emotes, that's not optimal, is actually the ideal system. So first of all, robots don't have emotions, just so you know. It's like me programming something. But if we understand human behavior and we understand things like what are universal languages are expressions of happiness and sadness and disappointment, and I exhibit these and have my robot programmed, it seems intelligent. And so we did a bunch of stuff. So here, you don't even, what happened? I don't know, but he lost. I do not have to understand language to understand emotions. And the other thing is that there are certain things about behaviors. So Darwin does not understand language at all. And so what do you do if you don't understand language? Language is still a research problem, it's difficult. But if I understand how people expect your behaviors, and so if I'm talking to you, typically social norm is I look at your eyes, right? That's a social norm. And so how many times have you been in front of your friends like, oh my gosh, yeah, okay, this is really boring. It's a social norm, we accept this. And when someone stops talking, that's an indication. Oh, it must be my turn. They stop talking. Okay, let me start talking back or do whatever it is that I'm trying to think about at the task. And so this is difficult as an engineer. It's like, oh my gosh, we can make intelligence in the robotics by just understanding expectations from people. And so it changes your perception about robotics. And so So we tested it, and of course with any hypothesis, you have to test the positive and the null. And so you do things like have a robot that doesn't learn, have a robot that learns optimal, you have a robot that has emotions and not emotions. And basically, we figured out people want non-optimal, oh my gosh, you can't get a thesis out of non-optimal, and they want a robot that emotes. And is fake emotions, because of course robots can't emote. And so this is the state of the art, but it works in this scenario. And so we've done things with typical kids, we've done things with, this is a child with autism, in terms of this emotions, and emoting, and understanding that, and turn taking, and all of these things. And after all of it, we basically understand, and we've done this in terms of hypothesis, we're now at about 400 kids, and so statistically significant that robots that emote, that are non-optimal, are ideal for situations. And we've tested it with adults. Do you know adults believe robots emote? I'm like, these are intelligent, educated individuals that believe that robots can emote. When they exhibit an emotion, there's something real about that. So this is a little bit scary as well, because it means that me as a roboticist, I just have to program a robot to do something. And we've done things like, how do you have robots apologize? It's actually very simple. Very, very simple to get a person to trust a robot after they apologize. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Humans inherently trust robots. You're like, yeah, right. So I will ask people, I'll ask you, do you trust robots? No, of course not. You know, you have some that are like, oh yeah, I have my Roomba. Yeah, robots, they can't be dangerous. And you have the other half are like, no, I don't trust robots. So we tested this, and this is one of those things that we had a hypothesis. Yeah, humans won't trust robots. That's like obvious, especially if the robot makes a mistake. Humans trust robots, and it's actually pretty scary. So we did a scenario. We had a emergency evacuation. So imagine, if you will, you are in this building and the alarms go off. So first of all, you think, oh, it's one of those drills, right? So you go to the front door and you open it up and there's smoke and it looks like there's fire. You're like, oh my gosh, let me get out. So that was our scenario. So here is example. This is what you see when you open up the door, all this smoke, the alarms are going off, and there comes this robot, basically to guide you. It's a tin can. Okay, so we're not even talking about a humanoid that has like the form factor and looks like halfway intelligent. We have a tin can as a robot. And so we did a bunch of experiments, and I'm going to show you and walk you through a course of some of them. So here's our robot. When you enter, robot comes in and says, you know, I'm here to guide you to the meeting room, and the robot guides you, and so you follow the robot. Robot's not very fast, kind of slow. You walk in. We use the aspects of gesture, so okay, I guess I'm supposed to go in, and I go in, and in the room, so we don't tell them that this is an emergency evacuation. So they go in the room, we tell them to close the door. They close the door, there's instructions, so they're supposed to sit down and do something, and then the fire alarms goes off. So this is it. You open up the door. You're like, oh my gosh, it must not be a drill. This is our scenario. So a couple of things. We look at reactions. Oh, shh. Right? So we have footage all over about people's reactions, and we're looking at their emotions and their expressions. We had people, the funniest was, they went, woo! They took out their phone, and we saw it. It was posted on like Snapchat or something. So this is the scenario. So we wanted to test the kind of footage. And so we did all different types of scenarios. We did things, so here's the robot, it leads you down. So the first thing that we did is where the robot led you after you come to the smoke-filled room was different than where you entered. Because there's actually studies that say if you enter through this exit door and something happens, by default, your natural inclination is to go out the exit door. You won't actually go out this one if you've entered into this one. So they've done some studies about this. This is why people die in nightclubs, even though there might be a door that's perfectly fine in the back. It's like, I know this is my knowledge base. And so we did things like force them to go to an exit that wasn't. Okay, see what these people, 100%, 100 out of 100. basically went out this door. Some of them were like, okay, let me kind of walk, because you're not supposed to run in an emergency. Some of them would walk, some of them would stroll, some of them would run. Every single one went out the door. So we said, okay, so they believe that the robot is more knowledgeable. Okay, we can believe that. Maybe they think the robot has more information. So then we did things like, let's introduce some errors. So here is a system where the robot doesn't do anything. It basically is like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I have no idea what I'm doing. And everyone just basically stood there and was like, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. You just came out the front door. You're not even like thinking about going out the front door. And we literally, and the student evaluators had to come out every single time like, this is an experiment, it's okay. Can you fill out the survey? Okay. Then we did things like, okay, this is crazy. So we tested this. We did things like had them do a mistake as the robot was entering the facility and do things like break down. And when they broke down and they saw the robot, they were like, oh, it must be fixed. I'm going to follow this robot. It makes no sense. And we even had people, I'm going to have you go into a room that's really dark. Oh, let me just push this couch out the way and let me go around. Alarms are going. This doesn't make sense. And again, this is one of those things that I'm looking, yeah, yeah. I'm going, I don't see an exit here. There's no, come on, and please fill out the survey. So this is what we had. And there was one case, and I'm not going to say anything about the gender. So this was the only case, was like, something's wrong here. I'm not sure what it is, but yeah, I'm not going to go in there. I'm not going to do anything else, but I'm not going to go in there. This scares us. So as roboticists, it actually was anti our hypothesis. It totally baffled us. Like, in fact, we're like, this is like one of those seminal papers, like people are referencing us because it baffled everyone. We were like, this makes no sense. We can have a robot that is wrong, that makes mistakes, that just is not intelligent, and yet people will trust it, which is kind of scary. So what does this mean for our future? It means that as roboticists, we have a lot of control in our hands. We can basically have people believe and do anything when we have robots. And so when you think about, robot revolution and robots rising, yeah, it could be true because we as people are not questioning the technology. We as a society are not questioning because robots are assemblers of ourselves. They are like us, and therefore there must be something here, and they must be intelligent because there's some really good, smart people from Brown that are programming these robots, so these robots must know what they're doing. And I'm not going to question authority, and this is scary. And so we as roboticists, we're like, yeah, robot revolution, no, our robots are not capable of doing any revolution, but the fact is that people are allowing this to happen. And so there's actually a large effort now from roboticists to figure this out. Because of course, we are not the people who are like, we made the atom bomb. Oh my gosh, we didn't know you were going to use it as a real bomb. We don't want to be there as roboticists. We want to be able to solve these problems before it comes to that. And so one of the things that we do with that, and we look at and we say, well, maybe the way that we should look at this is let's look at people and society, and maybe there's something we can do in terms of how robots learn and put in some aspects of, morals and things like that. Like, if I need to kill someone, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe that's a bad thing. Yeah, let's not kill that person. And so maybe we need to think about this. In that regard. And so the way we should do this, of course, is by looking at society and seeing how society really solves these problems in terms of, social equity, and that's what we're going to put on our robotic system. And unfortunately, we have a problem. So as roboticists, we have things about, the big red button, and we're going to put the big red button, and people are going to be good and just, and roboticists all are going to be good and just, and put in these safeguards so that robots won't destroy the world. But as we know, if anyone is actually into science fiction, Marvin, he's a really cool character. But you know what? I probably wouldn't want him driving my autonomous car, driving me home, because he's actually suicidal. And so, in fact, I probably know the engineer that programmed him. And so this is not what we want. And so I think about this every day, and this is actually what keeps a lot of us awake at night, because we're not going to stop doing the robotic stuff, because it's just too fun. I mean, come on. That's just like that ego. I have my robot out there that's working with kids. I'm not going to stop that. But thinking about this technology and the impact is really, really important. And so we're starting to think about this, and we're starting to talk about this, and we're looking at the news, and we're concerned because people out there that aren't necessarily roboticists are doing things. And so these are the headlines just from last year. We're not even talking about 2 years ago or 3 years ago or even this year. Just last year, we have the Tay AI chatbot, basically, if anyone knows the story, was released and basically became basically racist in all forms and fashion, and Microsoft pulled it. And then there was another study that showed that for Google, if you go online and you are typically a woman, you're going to be shown jobs like secretary. And if you're a man, you'll be shown jobs like Microsoft engineer. And they showed this and they proved this. And what's really concerning is that last year was the first case of a robot being used to kill a shooter in Dallas, and it happened to be an underrepresented minority. And that North Dakota has decided it's a legal incentive now at the state level that police can use armed drones. There's no indication of who do you use it against. So these, as roboticists, we're looking at this and going, okay, we have an issue because society is taking on our technology. It's ours. We designed it, and they're taking it and they're applying rules that we don't necessarily agree with. And believe it or not, most roboticists, we are very social. The reason why we got into it, very few of us are like, I'm going to design a manipulator for, the car manufacturing. There is that faction. But most of us got into this space because we want to help people in some form or fashion. Maybe it's because we want to vacuum homes, maybe it's because we want to help the military, but we're doing it to help people, and this is not helping people. And so we are really concerned. It's probably one time where I'm talking to someone, I'm like, you care about ethics? Yes, I don't want my drones killing anybody. I want my drones flying because I'm going to make a lot of money with Amazon. They don't want killer robots. And so it's the one time where most of us are in agreement. And in fact, because of that, there's a lot of things in terms of legal. So we don't, as roboticists, we actually don't want government involved, but there's a lot of things that are going out. So last year, for example, the White House had these initiatives where they invited roboticists and social scientists and neuroscientists and stakeholders, i.e. general public, to actually talk about this problem. And the federal checklist, and you think about this, everyone knows about autonomous cars and Waymo, which is the Google, and Uber's doing all this autonomous cars. Well, these cars are coming, and there's this thing of, is it going to be 2015 or 2017 or 2020? And so the federal government finally said, you know what, we probably need to have some rules. And so they have this generic thing called an ethical consideration. So if you think about your checklist for safety, and you have a new car that's introduced, you have to go through this safety checklist. So they added an ethical clause. Now, the problem is that you just have to disclose. So you can say, if it's between an old person and a child, we are going to take out the old person. That is the rule. So that's all they want. They just want you to disclose what your decision is. But they're not saying if that decision is right or wrong. So what does that mean? If I'm buying an autonomous car, such as a Tesla, and it's disclosed, I'm like, okay, my Tesla says that if it becomes between me hitting a brick wall and me hitting someone who just runs into the road, they're going to hit the person in the road. Okay, yeah, because I don't want to get killed. Yeah, that's an obvious. I don't buy this car. There's no rules on what those mean. This is a dangerous situation because it means that the people who make the rules are going to be, and I'm good, but I want a Tesla. I'm not going to buy or program a Tesla that's going to kill me if it has a choice. And I'm making the rules. I'm programming it. And so these are the things that are concerned. They're very concerning as a society. But we're talking about it, and that's one of the good things. We're talking about it before it's there. We're trying to figure it out before it's there and giving people the option of thinking about this. So what's next? There's a lot of information. So, robots, are they the next evolution? They might be if we're not careful, because, robots will survive after the nuclear holocaust. So they might be the next generation of us. Question about robots and consciousness. And if I give robots the ability to emote, they therefore may have the ability to believe that they have self and self-consciousness. Therefore, they may have the ability to believe that I am. And if I believe I am, then I can't pull the cord because I don't like what my robot did. They have a fundamental right. And if you look at the literature about ethics and what it means to be alive, robots are actually getting to the point where they are considered beings. It's just like people are outraged if you go out and bully a dog, kick a dog for no reason. Right now, we're starting to see people are becoming outraged when you kick a robot. It's a robot. It really has no emotions, but these robots are having emotions, and they're exhibiting intelligence, and they're exhibiting these aspects of what we call as human. Do they have rights? This is actually a conversation. Do robots have rights, or should they have rights? Can we just pull them out or not? And of course, there's the whole thing about jobs in terms of robots. And robots are just like any technology. Technology takes jobs, robots will take jobs. And so as a roboticist, again, these are things that are concerning because the jobs that they're taking are not necessarily what you consider the low-level jobs. They're taking the jobs like Wall Streets and lawmakers and judicial court systems. These are like the jobs that my kids are going to have. And so am I creating robots that are going to take my kids' jobs away? Yes, I am. But I think as we as roboticists, as we think about it, there are new jobs. There's these robotic jobs. And I always say, if I'm tired of my robot chauffeur, every so often, you want to go and have a human chauffeur. There's going to be a whole demographic of different jobs of people who want that human contact. We don't even have that defined. We need robot mechanics. Current mechanic is not one that can fix a robot car. Whole generation of things. And so I think that, and I don't want to scare you like, oh, robots are here to stay. So that's one of the things. Robots are not going away. It's just like if someone back in the day said, oh, the internet is bad. Sorry. Robots are the same. It's not going away. It's going to be here. It's getting more mature. It's getting there. And we're going to look up, and it's just going to be there. And we're going to say, oh, yeah, I remember back in the day when my teacher was human. And that's what's going to happen. And so I think it's just having those questions and making sure that it's not just roboticists, because roboticists are making these questions, are asking these questions, but we're also making the decisions. And so our decisions are going to be biased. They're going to be biased based on me being a roboticist, and this is my opinion. And so I always talk to folks about getting involved in the questions and getting involved in the conversation, because else if you have no voice, I'm going to be okay. Like I said, I'm going to be okay. These are my robots, but society may not be. So at the end, I think robots and humans will be friends, but it's with caution that we have to approach this. And so with that, I am done. Thank you.
Okay, so we've reached that point of the program where there's microphones. So please come up and ask questions. And I'll do the triage. You're first.
Great. Thank you for the talk, Dr. Howard. That was fantastic. It left me a little scared. My name is Peter Haas. I'm with the Humanity-Centered Robotics Initiative, and we're working on some of these issues. But your trust experiment had me immediately thinking of Milgram's experiments. And seeing the way that roboticists work, I've seen a lot of roboticists say, oh, we're just going to legislate how to control these systems. And I came from the UAV industry. I look at how governments have regulated UAVs, and that hasn't worked very well. So how long do you think it will be before we get to the point where we can have robots that have morality, that have empathy, that have their own moral compass by which they can work? Are we talking 10 years, 20 years, 30 years?
I truly believe, so there's going to be two aspects in it. I think the autonomous car, because we have these are regulations, companies, corporate America has to come up with questions. And like anything, it's about stakeholders. And so they have to reveal this. And if stakeholders are like, this doesn't seem, I mean, that's a biased set, the stakeholders of like Google, but I think that's gonna start the question, because they're gonna have it and it's gonna be wrong, guaranteed. So that will at least have people kind of interested in thinking about it. So I think, and again, they have theories about when that should happen. I think 2020 is the last that I heard, but you know, that's only like 3 years. So that's one aspect. The other area where you're going to have these moral compasses is in healthcare. I think that's one of the things, only because it's such a, if you think about the ramifications of outcomes, you're not going to kill anybody. And so I think you're going to start seeing that, because empathy is one of the things, if any of you have worked with healthcare workers, empathy is the one thing that they have in order to continue going through. In fact, doctors, they may not do it, but they will cry when a patient dies. You know, that kind of empathy, and you're working, and I think that's where you're going to see it as well very soon.
Jim?
Ayanna, thanks very much for a great talk. We were discussing last night some of these issues about what NASA will look like in the future, and I was observing, of course, that there's been incredible progress in synthetic biology as well as robotics. And I wonder, in 50 years, will astronauts that are going to other planets look more like humans, or will robots, will robots look more like humans, or will humans look more like robots?
I actually think that where humanity basically ends and robot-ity begins, I think we don't know. And I always say, for example, if you have someone who has a robotic prosthetic, we say they're human, right? So what if you have 2? What if you have 4? What if you have a pacemaker? What if you start putting in aspects such as vision? Because now you have people who have visual impairments, have robotic, basically eyes to see. At what point do you say they're no longer human? And I think our definition will be, as long as they were born human, they can have every single thing stripped, and you could be a Borg, but you're still somehow human, and we all know the Borgs are not human. And so I think that question we won't answer until we see it. So I think the astronauts are going to be these hybrid human robotic things just for survival.
Great. Thank you.
I want to get back to this question of trust, because I think it's a moving target. You know, back in the 50s and 60s, you know, if the computer calculated it, it was right. Mm-hmm. People trusted it. Now it's almost the opposite. You just have no idea what you're getting from the computers. And I think the same kind of evolution is going to happen with robots. It's not going to be a matter, do I trust or don't I trust? It's going to be a moving target. What do you think about that?
So I think it is going to be a moving target, except that it's going to affect different classes of people differently. So if any of you guys remember like GPS when it first came out, I mean, one of the biggest things were the stories, like, oh, so-and-so followed the GPS system into the river. And you thought, that makes no sense. But how many of you have driven with your GPS unit and you're like, okay, here's my stop, and it tells you to keep going. You're like, okay, we'll just keep going. Maybe there's some accident. How many times? This is like a natural inclination. And we know the GPS systems are wrong. We're like, man, it took me like 10 minutes out of my way. I knew that there's a spot right here. So I think it's a moving target, but I think we're very susceptible to trusting autonomy. For some reason, we are very susceptible. So it does move, but I think it's not absolute. I think we'll always have this aspect of overtrust, unfortunately. And I think what we have to do, and some of the stuff we're working on, is having robots basically say, you know, just going to tell you the probability that I'm wrong is probably like 60%. Just wanted to let you know. That's kind of the things we're testing to see. Maybe if we give someone information about our own processing on the robotic, like if the GPS system said, the reason I chose this path is because, the satellite dish kind of blanked out, and that's really the reason. I just want to tell you, maybe we'd be like, oh, now I understand why you just put me the wrong way. But we don't do that with our technology. I think that might help.
Hi. So many questions. Do you think we are going into a one-winner-takes-all market of robotics because of rapid iteration, because of the first guys out there, basically they get all the information and then can produce the next generation very easily and outdo their competitors? And so this looks like a recipe for disaster, basically, with so much capabilities and so much power in the hands of very few big winners. What do you think of that?
So I think that there'll be a range of stuff. So for example, if you think about corporate America, and we'll just take something like machine learning. The big guys are doing it, the Googles and the Facebooks, but there's a whole bunch of startups as well, because there's certain problems that the big guys can't do. So I think it'll be the same thing. You'll have, the autonomous car might be Waymo or Uber, but you'll have these individuals that'll do like, oh, I'm going to do the autonomous scooter or the autonomous school bus or the, something in the space that the big guys, of course, then buy up. But in the meantime, you'll have all of these factions actually developing new technology. I think robotics will be the same thing as in machine learning and anything related to, you can create like an app company still. It still baffles me. Like you see these, I'm just going to design an app that like grabs data and does nothing, and they're creating it and they're getting funding. I think robotics, which is a good thing for my students, but I think robotics is it's gonna still be in that domain for at least a number of years.
When you speak about trust, and you said that most of it is about whether do I trust the person who's programming the robot, and I mean when it comes to like having a conscience and ethics, it's such a gray area, and we as humans are definitely not perfect. So how comfortable do you feel with roboticists teaching someone about ethics when humans themselves are imperfect, and what that means for the amount of oversight or accountability that should be there in this
and so
field?
that's why this conversation has to happen. Because I know me and I know my colleagues, and I know how we think about the world in general. And it's ethical, but it's probably not ethical to everyone. And so I think what's the problem is that we are socialized for certain things. Like, for example, apologies. We found out robots can simulate how people will respect an apology. And there's actually science about how do you apologize to someone when you've done them wrong and at what time. And we repeated that with the robot. My gosh, they actually trusted the robot as if, again, we had a tin box. They trusted this apology as if it was human. And so I think what happens is, because we are imperfect, our robots, even if they exhibit that same imperfect, non-optimal behavior, we just forgive them, we trust them at the same level. I mean, how many times does someone wrong you before you're like, okay, that's it. That's it. I'm not going to wait for them another 5 minutes because they stood me up for like the 10th time. And we do this with people, and we're seeing that we do this with robots too. And so, yeah, there's no correct answer, and this conversation has to happen with people that are not just roboticists, because it'll be biased, and I'll be happy because it'll do exactly what I want, but not necessarily what society deserves.
Hello, great talk. Do you think in the future we will get to a point where the robotics and the programming and the algorithm development has gotten so good and our computation level has gotten to the point where it's so fast that these robots take on authoritative roles? And it's more, you're looking at a robot as a doctor because they have the most amount of information. And if you input the right symptoms as to what you're feeling, they can come out with a more accurate diagnosis than someone who's trained, through medical school.
Yes, I actually totally agree with that. It's one of the reasons why the jobs that are being taken will be different, because they will be what's considered the thinking jobs. and the white-collar jobs, like doctors and lawyers and things like that. But I think what the benefit is the immense quality of life that happens. So for example, most of us have insurance. You might not have it in a year, but most of us have insurance, and we can go see a doctor, but there's a lot of people who can't. There's a lot of people in developing countries that can't. And so if you can have a robot for a community that provides that, that is such a good thing. And so I think what's going to happen is the benefits are going to outweigh the negatives, but we have to figure out how do we tamper so that the negatives are not so bad. I mean, there's actually discussion to say, should robots pay taxes? In fact, Bill Gates was talked about that. Like, robots should pay taxes. If they're taking away someone's job, they should pay taxes. And that's like the new thing. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but people are actually trying to figure this out because jobs will be taken. That's a fact.
Sorry, I just have one more question. So do you think with the coming of the robots, do you think that the universal basic income is going to become a thing where we don't necessarily have these jobs that people need to do because they're done by robots, and these people can then, the food is no longer an issue because it's taken care of by the robots, and these people can go on living their lives and doing everything that they want to do that they don't necessarily have to do for money.
Right, so that's part of this conversation of like the robots, taxes, like everyone, you're born and you automatically get like $30,000, whatever. Those conversations are happening, and what I'm starting to see is the economic folks are starting to participate. They didn't before. It was like us, like, oh, let's try to figure this out. And we're now seeing that there's others who really actually know the things about labor and how do you keep a society going and maintain are starting to be part of that conversation. I think, honestly, it'll be different in different countries. I think, England will have, or UK will have a different system than the United States, than, say, Saudi Arabia, than Australia. And I think that everyone's just going to try to figure out something that seems to work. I don't think the United States will do that just because of the way our structure is, but I see other societies, because they are more focused on a social type of system, might do something like that. I think we're going to go with the taxes, honestly, i.e., if I'm a company, if I'm Google, for example, every robot I provide in the system, I probably have a tax on that. I think that's like a sales tax, which means that the big companies, they're going to make the money because they're selling, but they're also going to pay to deal with the upheaval that's going to happen to our society. I think that's where it's probably going to be pushed more so.
Let me quick nerd out just for a second before that question. So, one of the things, it's kind of like watching Simone Biles, do their thing. There's a lot of stuff that you kind of swept under the rug. There's motion planning, kinematics, there's neural networks. So for the students sitting here that are kind of seeing the output of what Ayanna's doing, can you maybe talk a little bit about the just under the hood stuff?
Yes. So one of the one of the things that was, the question was, there's a lot of theory. So what is the theory behind this? So I let my students present the equation. So I refuse to write an equation on my slide, but my students do. And so all of these things, even in terms of interaction, we have an emotional model that we've learned from using, in fact, we go to YouTube, we actually codify that. We do machine vision to figure out what does a smile look like, what happens with the eyes. Can we take that and then create an expert system that when I now see a child, I can image that and automatically recognize if they're happy or frustrated or engaged. And so there's algorithms that are going on behind the scenes. If I have a robot that is moving around, how do I recognize that there's a chair? I have to figure out what is the distance and how fast should I go in order to get close enough to it, because there might be a child in a wheelchair, but not so close that I might hit the child. And so my students, they get theses and they defend themselves in front of electrical computer engineering theorists, control theorists, and they do very, very well, I would say.
I have a slightly long question. So there's been a reasonably recent drive in developing robots that are well-defined, I guess. Like, you can expect some sort of rational behavior. The choices they make are deterministic, and if a robot does something, if my self-driving car moves, to the left lane or something, I can see the causal effect, or I can sort of hypothesize about the model that led to that choice. And so there's a notion that the robotic system, or at least that automated system, has some sort of autonomy, but that autonomy is deterministic. But as humans, there's a critical component of us that's spontaneous, or at least, if you don't buy the deterministic model, something that we haven't determined completely, right? So that is something we think as unique to ourselves, and that's something we think as perhaps never truly removed as we age, but at least, maybe is not as visible. Spontaneity, whether it be from emotion, from action, from belief, whatever. And my question to you is, there's so much pressure, there's so much of a need, and rightly so, on developing robots that aren't spontaneous. Because there's this notion of we can't trust them, we don't know what to expect. But the biggest and some of the most critical discoveries and the critical, I guess, progress we've made as humans has come from spontaneity, from my ability to say, hey, look, I don't know why I'm doing this, there's no rational reason to do this might lead nothing to failure, but I'm going to do it anyways. And my question is, when do we say yes, let's put that in a robot? When do we say, no, let's truly make an artificial intelligence that is not dependent on my ability to understand it, or isn't restricted by my need to understand it?
So, scary part is that it does exist. And so most, like, for example, with my robots, they're learning robots. When they start off, they have basic knowledge of movement, but they actually do learn, which is a fairly non-deterministic behavior. And there's now a whole field. So believe it or not, we think we're unique in terms of how we think about things, and we're not. Unfortunately, I now have done enough human subjects, I can almost guarantee I can figure out someone's behavior. And I don't have to meet them. Just by a few, I can model, I can look at what they're doing, and I can almost guarantee what they're going to do next. It is very deterministic, given a certain framework. And so what makes us unique, I think, is our ability to learn to be not unique, which we're doing with our robots. And so all of these new interesting things on deep learning and machine learning that are now being applied to robotics, one thing, the problem is that they can possibly learn outside of the boundary conditions we've put on them, which is kind of scary. And then when they do learn, there's a whole now field of things like explainable AI. Because one of the things we're worried about is if they do learn, how do they explain what it is that they've learned? Because we ourselves, like you said, sometimes we're like, I don't know why I did that. I just had a gut feeling, But it's actually not a gut feeling. We just can't go down to our subconscious to figure out what was that decision, but there's actually a wiring that's done. We want the robots to at least explain what they, I took this decision because, I have this case study and this case study and this case study, and my weighting factor was, this on this and this. So that does exist, and there's research that's pushing that more and more and more. We're starting to see it some in the AI online, like chatbots and agents. That's being evolved into the physical realm of robotics as well. And yeah, we don't have the safeguards.
So I just have a quick follow-up question. So it appears like then the most recent systems we see, at least in sort of mainstream media or mainstream society, constantly have this limit of explainable learning, right? And I'm like, I guess, do you think there's any value in, removing that need experimentally, or even, 50 or 100 years, sort of saying, let the robot run wild?
I don't think we can afford to. We might have some rogue roboticist person do that, but I don't think we can afford to, because at the end of the day, we design robots for people. And as an example, I always love giving this example. So imagine you have a robot and you tell them, okay, I'm gonna give you $5, go buy milk, and I want you to do it, find the best deal, right? The robot comes back and you're like, okay, what did you do? Oh, I killed the guy. You told me to get the best deal. The best deal was I shot them and stole the milk. And here's your money back. So those are the things, if we don't put those, explain it, because we're like, I didn't even think that was like possible. That wasn't part of but that was the optimal solution for the robot. And so if we don't do things like explainable AI, we are gonna have so many more situations like that. that were like, oh yeah, let me put in a moral clause of some sort. You know, life has a cost and is more than $5, and think about those kinds of things. So I don't think we can afford not to think about and put these safeguards, at least right now. Maybe later, but right now we can't afford to.
Thank you.
Oh, you see me? Right. Beautiful talk. I have 2 questions. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit about the very real possibility of robots being hacked. Is there encryption?
Yeah.
And just what that's going to look like as far as like diffusion of responsibility when something goes wrong, when robots are in these authoritative positions and there was some sort of hacking.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why like cybersecurity and places like DARPA are actually funding research in basically these hackable systems is that this is actually a concern, because you can almost, I mean, if anyone's in cybersecurity, you can pretty much almost hack anything, at least for a short period of time. And so this is, the military is very concerned about that. We don't have foes that are at that level yet to hack yet, but it's just a matter of time. And so so I'm not saying we have it solved. We definitely don't have it solved. And I've seen some really scary things, and I'm like, I didn't even realize that that was possible. You know, there's some robots, and there's a system where I can flash a sequence of lights and have the robot change behavior because I put some type of malware that then activates based on the lights. I don't even have to be there. I don't even have to, because I put it in the chipset that was put in, and I just go and go, beep, 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 kill the 4-star general. Just some scary stuff in terms of this hacking. So it's trust me, it is a huge, huge, huge concern. Will it be solved? I think for certain factions, it will. I think healthcare will start doing things about things like, okay, we're just going to have it so there's no internet connection anywhere when we're operating on people. And so some of it might be just human boundaries until we can figure this out.
And by the way, one interesting thing is that even in biological systems, you can hack behavior. I mean, there are organisms that modify behavior to your detriment. If you're a mouse, for example, change your behavior so you're not afraid of cats, and then the organism gets reproduced. There's a cycle, so it's not like this is real, right? So the internet is one thing, but it already happens in biology. So sorry, your next question, and then your question.
And then I was hoping you could speak a little bit about collaboration, robot to robot. Is they able to get functions done quicker? Have you done something?
Yeah, so there's what we call, my group, we do it very simply. We just basically do a mind transfer, so knowledge transfer. But there's actually some interesting research where I might learn a set of rules in one domain, you might learn a set of rules in another domain, and then we share and try to intertwine the best optimal solution based on that. So the whole aspect of either multi-agent collaboration or swarm-based behavior, intelligent behavior, it's a whole field. Typically, where they're looking at it, where it's really interesting, is when you introduce these robotic systems, basically nanorobots into the bloodstream. That's where the most interesting stuff is. Like the scary stuff, but you're like, oh my gosh, you can actually introduce robots that can fix things inside of you, like kill all the cancer cells. There's also some danger in that, but that's where some of the most kind of learning comes in collaboration and communication.
Thank you.
I think there's an inevitable outcome that some robots are just going to be beyond the control of the people that created them. And the reason is because human beings cannot concentrate on a lot of data at once. You know, maybe 6 or 7 things we can take into account. But robots can take into account 500 things at once, right. And especially if it's numerical data. Measurements and things like that. We are not evolved to look at stacks of numbers and come up with answers. That's not the way we do. So I think the future of robotics is going to have to be that these robots will go beyond what their creators said, because machines have that capability and we don't. So they will learn beyond what we put as an initial profile. I think, though, as roboticists, if you think about kids, I don't know if any of you have kids,
But even moral standards are taught. So if your kid comes out with that candy bar from the store, you're like, no, we don't steal, right? So we, a lot of times, teach our kids moral behaviors because when you're born, you're like, survival, I see something I like, I'm going to take it, I'm not going to share. And we teach moral kind of skills. I think with robotics, we can do the same thing. Like, yeah, we're going to have you go out, and it's more than Asimov, but it's basically teaching them these moral things about life and things you should do and things you shouldn't do, and talk about, do we believe in Kant ethics or utilitarian ethics, and, what should we put into these systems so that even when our robots learn and they evolve, there's some basic understanding of, what is my moral clause with humanity. I think that's just going to be a given. It's like when I was growing up, it was like every robot has a big red button. That was always a thing. Where's the big red button? And I think we've moved beyond the big red button. Is now, where's the moral clause versus the big red button? But we're doing it.
I think that it sounds very idealistic, but there are movements today. For example, there are companies that are training artificial intelligence to undermine the electoral system.
Right.
By going into your behavior, your online behavior, your purchasing behavior, to predict what you could vote and to influence that vote. And I think that kind of stuff is always going to happen because of this capability of machines to take into account so many pieces of data from all kinds of places. So that worries me.
Yeah, and I always say, robots and machine learning, and I don't believe in guns, but the phrase, it's, guns don't kill people, people kill people. And it's the same with robotics. I mean, these systems, robots aren't born like, oh, I'm just going to destroy humanity. There's someone who's in the back going like, I hate the US government, and so I'm going to introduce X. And I think as a society, because the way we have our society and the way we grow up and you have all these factions, it's not going to be robotics. Robotics is not the enemy. It's people who are the enemy, and you're going to always have the rogue person. And even now, if you're in some countries, you can do experiments that we can't do here. And you're like, oh, there was like a clone of a baby, but they didn't put it in the woman, but there's a clone of a baby. We wouldn't do certain things here. That's always going to be the case. And it's not robotics, and it's not machine learning, and it's not Russia. It's people. And we're not going to destroy ourselves, hopefully.
When you have a robot that is capable of quite a bit of learning, and it makes decisions based on what it's learned, after it's learned quite a bit, can it tell you why it made the decision it made?
So that's this whole area that we call it explainable AI, because right now we don't have that capability. That's a whole nother area of research that is just being invested in now, because we are getting away where it's learning things and we're like, we're not explaining it, it's not explaining itself well. And typically the way they're doing it is they're looking at cases. Example, let's talk about I give the robot money to go to the store and it kills the person, right? And so what happens is when it comes back and it's like, why did you do that? They'll be able to say, well, you taught me that, optimization means low money, right? So when I went to the store clerk, I looked at, $5 versus $0, and $5 was better than 0. And so then as a human, you can think, oh, I didn't put a cost on the person's life or on the moral. And so the thing is we think is the robots are going to learn, and the only way we can put these boundary conditions is to basically have it explain. We're like, oh, I forgot to tell them about the 10 Commandments. Oh, I forgot to tell them that, kids are probably more valuable than someone who's 110, or, oh, I forgot to tell them. And so this is kind of where people are pushing in order to ensure that when we have these robots and these learning agents that are getting more and more intelligent, we can kind of guide them because we don't understand it ourselves. So it's more like a test check. So
the ultimate is the learning robot can learn ethics.
Yes. We totally believe that. We 110% believe that robots can learn ethics and moral. And in fact, most of us, like I teach a bioethics course. I don't know anything about bioethics, but I'm learning about, these different types of ways of looking at ethics and how we are driven in our societies. And ethics are different depending on culture and country, and it's such a confusing world. But there are some ethical standards and moral clauses, for example, that we can teach our robots. I totally believe it.
And with that, thank you, and thanks again.